The artificial harbors rose from the English Channel like floating cities, hundreds of inflated obstacles drifting in precise formation as Allied armadas gathered beyond sight of the French coast. Under cover of dawn's gray light, thousands of landing craft pushed toward 5 beaches stretching across 70 miles of sand and surf, their ramps about to drop on the most important assault in human history. 6,000 ships carried nearly 3 million men across the Channel that morning, with thousands more airborne troops scattered over the Cotentin Peninsula in silence that would never come. General Dwight Eisenhower had positioned himself aboard the luxurious cabin cruiser Augusta, his weathered hands steady on the map table as he watched the first waves hit Omaha Beach, knowing that 25,000 of his soldiers would die before the sun climbed high enough to warm the blood-stained sands of Normandy. The decision to strike at Normandy on June 6, 1944 had taken years to plan, requiring more resources than any previous military operation in history. Churchill had warned of the colossal gamble, writing in his memoirs that it was the largest amphibious expedition ever attempted, while Hitler's forces remained dispersed across a vast front, trusting the deception that made Pas-de-Calais appear the real target. Erwin Rommel had rushed back to Germany to be with his dying wife, leaving his panzer divisions in the wrong positions, while his absent men would find themselves facing bombardiers who had practiced their craft for months against the very beaches they would soon assault. The Allies had spent 2 years building the machinery of invasion. Massive engineering projects transformed the coast with American inspected the Atlantic Wall, arranging his coastal defenses with brutal efficiency, yet his absence during the crucial days before D-Day would allow the Allies to seize a foothold that his superiors would struggle to dislodge. The fortifications built by slave laborers and defended by teenage soldiers would face artillery barrages that would render many of them useless before the first infantry assault. The British sector of the Normandy coast held the village of Arromanches, where the tide pools would soon reflect the smoke of burning landing craft and the glint of burning rubber from inflated boats destroyed on the beach. Canadian forces knew that the Rangers would scale the bluffs at Pointe du Hoc, their ropes slicing through the morning fog as they prepared to neutralize the heavy artillery that threatened the entire invasion. These men would scale cliffs that no engineer had ever successfully climbed, carrying their equipment in packs while their officers calculated the odds of reaching the guns before the Germans could turn them on the beaches below. The airborne assault would begin in the darkness before dawn, with paratroops dropping from aircraft that filled the night sky like falling stars. The 101st Airborne would secure the intersection of roads leading to Caen and Bayeux, while the 82nd Division aimed to capture the key bridges over the Meurthe River, their mission critical to preventing German armored counterattacks from counterattacking the beachhead. These isolated units would fight their way through the night, often finding themselves in fierce combat with German rear area troops who had not realized their presence until American voices shouted commands in the darkness. The loss of life would be staggering, with Allied casualties reaching nearly 50,000 within the first day alone. Yet for all the planning and preparation, the invasion would succeed or fail based on factors beyond any general's control. Weather conditions that Eisenhower had monitored for weeks would determine whether the operation proceeded on schedule, while the morale of troops who had never seen combat would prove more important than the elaborate deception operations that had convinced the Germans their precious panzers like vultures, strafing German positions that threatened to push the invaders back into the sea. The USS Texas, a battleship that had fought since World War I, shelled the bluffs from just 1,000 yards offshore, its 14-inch shells sending chunks of concrete raining down on German defenders who had expected to be safe behind reinforced positions. Meanwhile, engineers raced against time to clear obstacles and minefields under sniper fire, their work often costing them their lives, but gradually creating paths for tanks and supplies to reach the shore. In the command ship USS Augusta, General Omar Bradley watched the progress through binoculars, his face grim as reports of heavy casualties filtered in. The entire invasion plan had been predicated on securing beach exits within hours. Yet at Omaha, American troops remained trapped for most of the morning. Communications between the Beachmasters and the invasion fleet had been disrupted by German jamming, forcing junior officers to make critical decisions without guidance from above. It was in these moments of chaos that leadership emerged in unexpected places. Sergeants taking charge when officers fell, medics continuing to treat the wounded under fire, and ordinary soldiers showing extraordinary courage under impossible conditions. By mid-morning, the situation began to shift as small groups of soldiers began to infiltrate German positions using the cover of smoke and artillery. On the eastern edge of Omaha, elements of the 5th Ranger Battalion managed to find a path up the bluffs where engineers had missed, establishing a foothold that others could follow. At Utah Beach, where the airborne assault had disrupted German defenses, the 4th Infantry Division met far lighter resistance than anticipated, allowing tanks and equipment to move inland much faster than planners had predicted. The contrast between the two American beaches would later become a case study in military adaptation, demonstrating how initiative could overcome even the most dire circumstances. Behind the front lines, the deception operations that had consumed Allied intelligence for months began to bear fruit. The Germans, convinced that the main attack would come at Pas de Calais, hesitated to commit their panzer divisions against the Normandy beachhead. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of German forces in the west, repeatedly requested permission to launch his armored reserves, but Adolf Hitler, believing the Normandy landings were a feint, delayed authorization for nearly 24 critical hours. When the 1st Panzer divisions finally moved against the beaches on June 7th, Allied air superiority had already established control over the skies, making daylight movement suicidal and severely hampering the German response. The British and Canadian sectors faced different challenges. At Gold Beach, the 50th Division pushed inland toward Bayeux, securing the first major town captured on D-Day. At Juno Beach, Canadian troops encountered stiff resistance but managed to advance farther than any other Allied force on the first day, establishing contact with British units at Sword Beach. There, British paratroops had secured the bridges over the Orne River in a daring pre-dawn assault, preventing German armored units from flanking the entire invasion force. The success at Sword allowed the British to push toward Caen, though the city would become a bloody stalemate that would define the Normandy campaign for weeks to come. In the days following the initial assault, the Allied forces struggled to consolidate their gains. The Bocage country of Normandy, a patchwork of small fields separated by thick hedgerows, created natural defensive positions that favored the defenders. German forces, though outnumbered and outgunned, used the terrain expertly, their machine gun nests and anti-tank guns hidden behind centuries-old earthworks. Each advance became a measured process of clearing hedgerow by hedgerow, costly in lives but steady in progress. Engineers developed hedgehog devices that allowed tanks to cut through the thick barriers, transforming the battlefield and breaking the stalemate that had threatened to trap the invasion force. On June 12th, two crucial events occurred that would shape the campaign. First, American forces from Utah Beach finally linked up with those at Omaha, creating a continuous front that could be supplied and reinforced. Second, the first artificial harbor, codenamed Mulberry A, became operational off Omaha Beach, allowing supplies to be landed directly from ships without unloading onto smaller craft under fire. This engineering marvel, built from prefabricated concrete sections sunk in place, would become the lifeline of the entire invasion force, capable of unloading 7,000 tons of supplies per day at its peak. As the beachhead expanded, the focus shifted from simply establishing a foothold to breaking out into the French interior. Montgomery, commanding all ground forces in Normandy, planned a major offensive codenamed Operation Cobra, designed to punch through German lines near St. Lo. This operation, scheduled for late July, would require careful preparation as Allied air forces worked to soften German defenses and disrupt their supply lines. The fighting in Normandy had evolved from a desperate beachhead defense to a deliberate campaign of attrition, with each side committing more resources in a struggle that would determine the fate of not just France, but the entire European war. By the time the last of the D-Day veterans stepped ashore on June 6, 1944, a new front had been opened in the war against Nazi Germany. The invasion had succeeded against impossible odds, proving that Allied planning, courage, and firepower could overcome even the most fortified defenses in Europe. The men who had fought and died on those beaches had not just opened a path to Berlin, they had begun the final chapter in the greatest conflict in human history, a chapter that would end with the liberation of Europe and the dawn of a new era in world affairs. Their legacy, written in sand and blood on the shores of Normandy, would forever stand as a testament to the cost of freedom and the power of determination in the face of tyranny. The breakout from Normandy came at a terrible cost. Operation Cobra, launched on July 25th, unleashed a devastating Allied air campaign that turned the countryside into a hellscape of smoke and fire. Hundreds of fighter bombers roared overhead, strafing German positions and dropping thousands of pounds of explosives onto the hedgerow country. General Omar Bradley, who had taken command of the First Army after the death of Major General Leslie McNair, watched from a ruined chateau as waves of Mustangs and Thunderbolts blasted the enemy lines. When American tanks finally surged forward through the gap, they encountered fierce resistance from battle-hardened Waffen-SS divisions, including the elite 1st SS Panzer Corps. The fighting raged through the shattered streets of Marigny and Le Depute, where Sherman tanks knocked out Panther after Panther in brutal close combat. As the American spearheads pushed eastward, the German situation in Normandy rapidly deteriorated. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, the newly appointed commander of Army Group West, made desperate attempts to reinforce the threatened sectors. But the Allied stranglehold on transportation networks meant that panzer divisions arrived piecemeal, often without fuel or ammunition. Meanwhile, the constant Allied bombing raids had destroyed rail lines and bridges across northern France, leaving German units immobilized in the face of the growing threat. Adolf Hitler, ensconced in his Wolfschanz headquarters, continued to insist on counterattacks that were logistically impossible, further weakening the already overstretched Wehrmacht formations. By early August, the encirclement at Falaise became inevitable. Canadian forces advancing from the north met American units pushing southward, trapping entire German armies in a killing zone that stretched from Argentan to Vimoutiers. The retreat from the Falaise pocket turned into a nightmare of burning tanks, abandoned artillery, and desperate soldiers fleeing through the ruins of Kemmendavranches. Soviet observers later estimated that over 50,000 German troops were killed, wounded, or captured during the catastrophic withdrawal. The smoking wrecks of panzers littered the countryside, their crews either dead or taken prisoner as the remnants of Army Group Center struggled to escape westward toward the Seine River. The liberation of Paris on August 25 marked another pivotal moment in the campaign. French forces of the interior, operating under the codename Dien Bien Phu, had spent weeks coordinating sabotage operations with Allied planners. Members of the resistance tore up railway tracks, destroyed communication lines, and attacked German garrison positions throughout the city. When Free French armored divisions under General Philippe Leclerc finally entered Paris, they found a population that had endured 4 years of occupation but was ready to rise up in defiance. Civilians emerged from cellars and apartments to greet their liberators, while snipers still held out in the upper floors of historic buildings along the Champs-Élysées. The fall of the city sent shockwaves through the German High Command, as it demonstrated how quickly the Allied advance was reshaping the strategic landscape. Beyond the immediate tactical victories, the Normandy campaign revealed fundamental weaknesses in the German war machine. The shortage of fuel had become critical by mid-1944, with panzer divisions often unable to move even short distances without captured Allied gasoline. The Allied bombing campaign had systematically destroyed German aircraft production facilities, leaving the Luftwaffe unable to provide adequate air support. On the ground, veteran units were rotated to Normandy, only to discover that their replacements were often poorly trained Volksgrenadier divisions composed of teenagers and elderly men. These formations proved no match for the overwhelming firepower and coordinated tactics that the Allies had refined since the disaster at Dieppe in 1942. The human toll of the invasion continued to mount throughout the summer. By September, when the last German positions along the Somme were eliminated, casualty figures told the story of unprecedented ferocity. American forces had suffered over 100,000 casualties in the 3 months since D-Day, while British and Canadian losses approached 80,000. German fatalities exceeded 200,000, with many more wounded or missing. Yet these staggering numbers represented only part of the broader conflict. Behind the front lines, the French civilian population struggled to survive amid the ruins of their towns and farms. Approximately 20,000 French citizens died during the Liberation Campaign, victims of crossfire, bombardment, and reprisals from both sides. As autumn approached, the focus shifted toward breaching Germany's western defenses. The Siegfried Line, stretching along the French-German border, presented the next major obstacle. Allied engineers worked tirelessly to construct pontoon bridges across the Rhine, while special forces units infiltrated behind enemy lines to disrupt communications. The amphibious capabilities developed during the Normandy landings now found new purpose in crossing German rivers, with specialized DD tanks swimming ashore at targets along the Rhineland. Each successful river crossing brought the Allied armies closer to the heart of the Third Reich, while German forces continued to fall back toward prepared defensive positions in the east. The strategic implications of D-Day extended far beyond the immediate military situation. Joseph Stalin, watching from Moscow, now pressed more aggressively for a second front in the Balkans, while simultaneously preparing his own massive winter offensive in the east. The successful establishment of the Normandy bridgehead meant that German resources could no longer be concentrated entirely against the Soviet Union. Perfected techniques for breaching seawalls under fire. The development of specialized armor, including flame-throwing tanks and bunker-busting artillery pieces, reflected the technological arms race that characterized modern warfare. These innovations, tested in the crucible of Normandy, would influence military thinking long after the guns fell silent. In the years following the war, historians would debate whether the German defeat resulted primarily from superior Allied planning or German operational failures. What remained indisputable was the courage displayed by ordinary soldiers in extraordinary circumstances. Men like technician 4th grade John Steele, forever captured in Robert Capa's famous photograph of the St. Mère Église parachute drop, embodied the determination that turned back the tide of fascism. Their stories, preserved in countless oral histories and personal accounts, reminded future generations that victory required not just strategy and technology, but the willingness of individuals to sacrifice everything for a greater cause. The legacy of Normandy continued to evolve even as the immediate military crisis subsided. The successful implementation of joint operations between American, British, Canadian, and Free French forces established precedents for international cooperation that would shape post-war alliances. The Brethren of August 1944 demonstrated that combined arms warfare could achieve results impossible through single national efforts. Meanwhile, the experience of fighting through fortified positions influenced American military doctrine for decades to come, contributing to planning for operations in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. By December 1944, as German forces launched their last major offensive in the Ardennes, the strategic initiative had passed irrevocably to the Allies. The Normandy landings had achieved their primary objective of opening a permanent second front, but more importantly, they had demonstrated that the Germans could be defeated through sustained application of combined military power. Every mile of territory liberated from the shores of the English Channel to the banks of the Rhine represented not just a tactical victory, but a step toward the final destruction of Nazi Germany itself. The world would remember June 6, 1944, not merely as another date in a long war, but as the moment when the balance of power shifted decisively against tyranny. The day the tide began to turn in Normandy was a moment etched in the thunder of engines and the gasp of fear-filled breathing. From the cliffs overlooking the beach, commanders eyed the vast expanse of sands stretching toward the British shore, where thousands had ever united under the weight of history. Soldiers from France, Britain, Canada, and even Free France arrived here with maps tucked beneath their coats and a shared resolve that had never been forced upon them. This was no ordinary gathering. It was the spark that ignited the largest operation the world had ever seen. Planeloads of planes cut through the sky, their airframes slicing across the dawn like lightning, while tanks from the British Expeditionary Force rumbled forth on the beaches, their routes braced with precision. Behind every vehicle stood seasoned infantrymen, their faces set with determination, knowing the stakes had never been higher. This was more than an invasion. It was a necessity, a turning point that would shape continents and alter the course of the 20th century. As the first waves of troops landed, the atmosphere crackled with tension and a quiet resolve, setting the stage for a battle that would resonate long after the final flag was raised. The air was thick with anticipation, and the world watched as history was about to unfold in ways no one could have predicted. The Ardennes offensive, launched through the snow-covered forests of Belgium and Luxembourg on December 16th, represented Hitler's final gamble to split the Allied armies and force a negotiated peace in the West. German panzer divisions, including the 6th SS Panzer Army under Sepp Dietrich and the 5th Panzer Army commanded by Hasso von Manteuffel, struck through the thinly held American lines along an 80-mile front. The initial breakthrough created a dangerous salient that bulged westward toward the Meuse River, threatening to sever British and American forces and recapture the vital port of Antwerp. American units caught in the opening assault fought desperate delaying actions at critical road junctions. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division, reinforced by elements of the 10th Armored Division and combat engineers, formed a perimeter defense around the crucial crossroads town. Surrounded, outnumbered, and short on ammunition, medical supplies, and cold weather gear, the paratroopers held their ground through Christmas week as German artillery pounded their positions. When the German commander demanded surrender, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe responded with a single word that became legend: nuts. To the north, Kampfgruppe Pieper, the spearhead of the 6th SS Panzer Army, raced toward the Meuse bridges, but found its advance blocked by blown bridges, fuel shortages, and fierce resistance from American engineers and tank destroyers at Stoumont and La Glaise. The massacre of American prisoners at Malmedy by Waffen-SS troops hardened Allied resolve and eliminated any possibility of quarter being given or expected. Clear weather finally returned on December 23rd, unleashing Allied air power that had been grounded for a week. Fighter bombers and heavy bombers swarmed the battlefield, devastating German supply columns and armor concentrations in the open. By early January 1945, the German offensive had exhausted itself. The salient was eliminated through coordinated counterattacks by Patton's Third Army from the south and Montgomery's 21st Army Group from the north. The Wehrmacht had committed its last strategic reserves. irreplaceable tanks, aircraft, and veteran formations, and lost them. The path to the Rhine lay open. February and March brought the Great Allied Offensive into the German heartland. Operation Veritable, launched by the 1st Canadian Army and British XXX Corps through the Reichswald Forest, and Operation Grenade, the 9th Army's crossing of the Ruhr River, converged to clear the west bank of the Rhine. In the south, the 7th Army and 1st French Army eliminated the Colmar Pocket, while Patton's 3rd Army drove through the Eifel and Hunsrück regions, capturing Trier and Koblenz. The capture of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen on March 7th provided the first Allied bridgehead across the Rhine. Combat engineers of the 9th Armored Division seized the span minutes before German demolition charges could destroy it, establishing a foothold that expanded rapidly despite furious German counterattacks involving jet aircraft, V-2 rockets, and frogmen attempting to blow the bridge from underwater. Within days, 5 divisions had crossed, and pontoon bridges supplemented the damaged structure. Simultaneously, Montgomery meticulously prepared Operation Plunder, the massive 21st Army Group crossing near Wesel on March 23, preceded by the largest artillery bombardment in the West since Normandy and supported by Operation Varsity. The airborne assault by the British 6th and American 17th Airborne Divisions. The crossing succeeded against crumbling resistance. Churchill and Brooke watched from the West Bank as Buffalo amphibious vehicles carried Scottish and Canadian infantry across the wide river. In the south, Patton's 3rd Army executed a surprise crossing at Oppenheim on March 22, stealing a march on the Field Marshal. By April, Allied armies fanned out across Germany. The 9th Army and 1st Army encircled the Ruhr Pocket, trapping Field Marshal Model's Army Group B, over 300,000 German soldiers, in the industrial heartland. Model dissolved his command rather than surrender, shooting himself in a forest near Duisburg. The race to the early to propaganda. Hitler committed suicide in his Berlin bunker on April 30th. German forces in Italy surrendered May 2nd. In Reims, at Eisenhower's headquarters in the Red Schoolhouse, General Alfred Jodl signed the unconditional surrender of all German forces on May 7th, effective the following day. A second ceremony in Berlin, attended by Soviet Marshal Zhukov, British Air Chief Marshal Tedder, and American General Spaatz, ratified the document. The war in Europe was over. The Normandy veterans who had survived the hedgerows, the breakout, the Ardennes, and the Rhine crossing found themselves in a shattered continent. They occupied a defeated nation, distributed food to starving civilians, guarded displaced persons' camps, and began the long process of denazification and reconstruction. Many would remain in Germany for years, the occupation army becoming the foundation of NATO's forward defense during the Cold War that followed. The artificial harbor at Arromanches, the mulberry that had sustained the invasion through the summer storms, slowly succumbed to the Channel tides. Its concrete caissons still visible at low tide, silent witnesses to the logistical miracle that made victory possible. The bunkers of the Atlantic Wall remain embedded in the Normandy cliffs, their gun embrasures facing a sea that no longer brings invaders. Farmers still turn up rusted ammunition and twisted metal in their fields, the iron harvest of 1944. Cemeteries dot the Normandy landscape. American, British, Canadian, German, Polish. At the American cemetery above Omaha Beach, 9,388 white marble crosses and stars of David face westward toward the country those soldiers left behind. The names on the wall of the missing, 1,557 of them, represent those who fell in the waters off the coast or in the hedgerows beyond, their bodies never recovered. Every June 6th, veterans returned in diminishing numbers. They walked the beaches where they had landed as boys, now old men supported by children and grandchildren. They stood at the water's edge at low tide, looking out at the horizon where the greatest armada in history had appeared through the dawn mist. Some knelt in the sand. Some wept quietly. Some simply stared, seeing again the smoke, the fire, the comrades who didn't make it off the beach. The last surviving Medal of Honor recipient from D-Day, Charles Coolidge, died in April 2021. The last surviving general officer who landed on D-Day, James Gavin of the 82nd Airborne, died in 1990. The living memory of June 6, 1944, has passed from living testimony to recorded history. But the strategic lessons endure. The necessity of Allied unity, the primacy of logistics, the integration of air and ground power, the courage required to breach a defended shore against a determined enemy. The invasion that changed the world did not end on the beaches. It ended in the rubble of Berlin, in the surrender document signed in a French schoolhouse, in the occupied zones that became the front line of a new confrontation, in the European Union that grew from the ruins of empire, in the Atlantic alliance that still guards the peace won at such cost. The tide that turned in Normandy continues to shape the world the veterans left behind, the world they purchased with their youth, their blood, and the lives of those who never came home.